When we talk about anger, most people think of it as a problem to control. From a very young age, many of us were taught that anger is something dangerous, something disruptive, something that makes relationships unstable. So we learn to push it down, silence it, or hide it behind politeness. But what we rarely talk about is that anger itself is not the real emotion. In many cases, anger is simply the bodyguard for something much more vulnerable. This is one of the most important emotional truths we can learn. Anger is often a secondary emotion. It rises quickly, it feels powerful, and it gives us the illusion of control. But beneath it, there is almost always something softer and more fragile: hurt, fear, rejection, disappointment, shame, or grief. Think about how quickly anger appears when you feel betrayed. The moment trust breaks, anger steps forward almost immediately. It gives you energy, it gives you a sense of protection. In a strange way, it can even make you feel stronger. But if you slow down and really examine that moment, you will often discover that the anger arrived after something else. First came the pain. First came the realization that someone mattered to you more than you expected. First came the feeling of being exposed. Anger is the armor we put on when our emotional skin has been cut. Psychologically speaking, anger functions as a defense mechanism. It organizes our emotional chaos into something that feels manageable. When we feel hurt, we feel vulnerable, and vulnerability is uncomfortable because it exposes our need for connection. Anger, on the other hand, feels active. It feels powerful. It shifts us from feeling wounded to feeling defensive. But here is where things become complicated. When anger becomes the only emotion we express, the people around us never see the real story. They only see the shield. They see the frustration, the irritation, the raised voice, the distance. What they do not see is the deeper emotional truth hiding behind it. And when that happens, communication breaks down. The other person responds to the anger, not to the pain underneath it. They become defensive. They protect themselves. And suddenly two people are arguing about tone, words, or behavior, while the real emotional injury remains completely unspoken. This is why learning to be vulnerable with anger is such an important emotional skill. Vulnerability does not mean suppressing anger or pretending it does not exist. That approach almost always fails because suppressed anger does not disappear. It accumulates. It turns into resentment. It shows up later as sarcasm, distance, passive aggression, or emotional withdrawal. Vulnerability with anger means doing something much more courageous. It means becoming curious about your anger instead of immediately acting on it. It means asking a deeper question: what is this anger protecting? Is it protecting the pain of feeling unimportant? Is it protecting the fear that you are not valued? Is it protecting the disappointment that someone you trusted did not show up for you? These questions slow anger down just enough for us to see what is really happening emotionally. And once we see it, something remarkable begins to change. The anger starts to transform from a weapon into a signal. It becomes information rather than pure reaction. Instead of saying, "Why am I so angry?" the question becomes, "What does this anger reveal about what matters to me?" Because anger rarely appears without meaning, in many cases it is pointing directly at our values. We get angry when trust is broken because we value loyalty. We get angry when we are dismissed because we value respect. We get angry when we feel unseen because we deeply value connection. In that sense, anger is not simply emotional chaos. It is emotional data. But data is only useful if we are willing to examine it honestly. And this is where vulnerability enters the picture. To be vulnerable with anger means having the courage to say something that feels much more difficult than expressing frustration. It means revealing the emotion that anger was trying to hide. Instead of saying, "You never listen to me," vulnerability says, "When I feel ignored, it hurts more than I expected." Instead of saying, "I'm furious about what happened," Vulnerability might say, "I think what I'm actually feeling is disappointed because I really trusted you." These statements may seem simple, but psychologically, they represent a massive shift. They move us away from emotional armor and toward emotional truth. And emotional truth is what allows healing to begin. When people can see the real feeling beneath the anger, they have something they can actually respond to. They can understand it, they can empathize with it, they can meet it with care instead of defense. Anger alone pushes people away. Vulnerability invites them closer. This does not mean every person will respond perfectly. Some people struggle with emotional honesty, and some conversations will remain difficult. But when we learn to recognize the deeper emotion beneath our anger, we stop being controlled by it. Instead of reacting automatically, we begin responding consciously, and that shift changes everything. Because the goal of emotional growth is not to eliminate anger. Anger is a natural human emotion, and it will always appear when something important is threatened. The real goal is to understand what anger is trying to tell us about our emotional world. When we develop the courage to look beneath anger rather than simply act through it, we begin to access the deeper truths about our needs, our boundaries, and our values. And the moment we start listening to anger instead of fighting it, it stops controlling us and starts guiding us. Because anger is not the enemy. It is simply the messenger pointing us toward the vulnerability we have been trying to protect. Once we begin to understand that anger is often protecting something more vulnerable underneath, the next step becomes even more important. It's one thing to recognize the deeper emotion within ourselves. It's another thing entirely to communicate it in a way that creates connection rather than conflict. This is where many relationships struggle, not because people do not care about each other, but because anger is usually expressed without vulnerability. When anger is delivered on its own, it often sounds like blame, criticism, or accusation. The message might be emotionally valid, but the way it is communicated immediately activates defensiveness in the other person. Think about how most conflicts unfold. Someone feels hurt, but instead of expressing the hurt, they express the anger that followed it. The words come out sharper than the feelings behind them. The tone becomes protective, and almost instantly the other person shifts into self-defense mode. At that moment, the conversation is no longer about understanding. It becomes about winning, explaining, or protecting one's own position. This dynamic happens in families, friendships, workplaces, and romantic relationships. Two people can care deeply about each other and still end up in cycles of misunderstanding simply because the emotional message is delivered through anger rather than vulnerability. Anger alone builds walls. Vulnerability, however, has the power to open doors. When anger is paired with honesty about the deeper feeling beneath it, something important changes in the psychological space between two people. The conversation stops being about attack and defense, and it begins to move toward understanding. This does not mean the conversation becomes easy. Vulnerability is rarely comfortable. In fact, vulnerability can feel far more risky than anger. Anger protects us. It gives us emotional distance. It allows us to feel strong in moments when we might otherwise feel exposed. Vulnerability does the opposite. It removes the armor. It says something like, "I'm not just upset about what happened, I'm hurt." Or, "I think I reacted strongly because this mattered to me more than I realized." Those statements require courage because they reveal the softer parts of our emotional experience. And for many people, that feels dangerous. There is always the possibility that the other person might not respond with care. But here is the paradox. Vulnerability is actually what creates the possibility for genuine connection. When someone hears anger alone, they prepare to defend themselves. But when someone hears the truth beneath the anger, they are far more likely to respond with empathy. They begin to see the human experience behind the reaction. Psychologically, this shift is profound. Vulnerability activates empathy in the listener. It allows the other person to step out of a defensive posture and into a relational one. Instead of asking, "How do I protect myself in this conversation?" they begin asking, "What is this person actually feeling?" That shift can transform the entire emotional atmosphere of a conversation. Consider the difference between these two statements. "You never listen to me." Most people, when they hear that sentence, immediately begin searching for evidence that it is not true. Their mind goes into defense mode. They start remembering the times they did listen, the moments they tried, the reasons they were distracted. But now imagine a different sentence. "When I feel ignored, it hurts more than I know how to explain." That sentence lands in a completely different place emotionally. It does not accuse, it reveals. It gives the other person access to the real emotional experience rather than forcing them into a debate about behavior. This is the power of vulnerability within anger. It changes the purpose of the conversation. Instead of proving who is right, the conversation becomes an opportunity to understand what someone is feeling and why it matters. Philosophically speaking, vulnerability reintroduces humanity into conflict. It reminds both people that beneath the disagreement are two emotional lives trying to be seen, heard, and respected. And when people feel seen, something remarkable happens. The intensity of the conflict often decreases. Not because the issue disappears, but because the emotional distance between the people begins to shrink. Anger creates distance. Vulnerability creates proximity. This does not mean vulnerability guarantees agreement. Two people can still have different perspectives, different needs, or different interpretations of a situation. But when vulnerability is present, those differences can be explored without turning the relationship into a battlefield. This is particularly important when it comes to boundaries. Many people believe that expressing vulnerability makes them weaker or less assertive. In reality, the opposite is true. Vulnerability often clarifies boundaries rather than weakening them. When someone says, "This situation hurt me, and I need things to change," they are not abandoning strength. They are combining honesty with self-respect. The anger signals that something important has been crossed. The vulnerability explains why it matters. Together, they create communication that is both emotionally honest and psychologically clear. Over time, relationships that practice this kind of communication develop deeper trust, not because conflict disappears, but because both people learn that even difficult emotions can be expressed without destroying the connection. That kind of trust is rare, and it is incredibly powerful. It allows people to move through disagreements with curiosity instead of fear. It creates space for growth rather than resentment. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that emotional honesty does not have to lead to separation. It can actually lead to stronger connection. But this transformation begins with a simple shift in how we express anger. Instead of asking, "How do I prove my point?" we begin asking, "What am I really feeling beneath this anger, and can I share that truth?" That question requires courage. It requires self-awareness, and sometimes it requires slowing down long enough to recognize what is happening inside us before we react. Yet when we do it, we change the nature of our relationships, because anger expressed alone may win arguments, but vulnerability expressed within anger builds understanding. And in the end, the goal of emotional growth is not to become someone who never feels anger. The goal is to become someone who can transform anger into honest communication and meaningful connection. The real strength is not in how loudly we express our anger. The real strength is in how honestly we reveal the truth that anger is trying to protect.